In the scorching summer of 421 BC, a young woman named Eumelia stood trembling among the smoldering ruins of Mantinia, watching Spartan soldiers move methodically through the survivors like wolves selecting prey. She was 26 years old. 3 days earlier, her husband Cleomenes had died on the city walls, his body still lying somewhere in the rubble with hundreds of other defenders who had tried and failed to stop the Spartan war machine. Eumelia had spent those 3 days hiding in a cellar with her 3 children, listening to the sounds of battle above, the screams of dying men, the terrible silence that meant everything was lost. Now the silence was broken by new sounds, the clanking of chains as surviving men were marched away, the wailing of women being separated from their families, the cold, efficient voices of Spartan officers organizing the defeated population into groups, each group destined for a fate none of them could yet imagine. Eumelia clutched her children closer as a Spartan commander approached, his eyes scanning her with a detached assessment of someone examining livestock at market. He asked her age. He asked if the children were hers. When she answered, barely able to speak through her terror, he made a mark on his wax tablet and moved on without explanation, leaving her standing there with no idea what that mark meant, what category she had just been placed into, what horror awaited her in the hours ahead. That evening, everything Eumelia knew ended. She was separated from her 7-year-old daughter, her 5-year-old daughter, her 3-year-old son. She heard their screams as she was dragged away. She heard her youngest crying out for her, saw his small hands reaching toward her as an elderly woman held him back. She tried to memorize their faces, knowing with a certainty that pierced her heart that she might never see them again. 200 women from Mantinia were marched out of the city that night under Spartan guard, given barely enough food and water to survive, sleeping on bare ground, walking for 3 days toward Sparta and whatever fate the conquerors had planned. None of them knew what awaited them, but they had all heard the whispered stories that circulated through Greece about what Sparta did to captured women. Stories so disturbing that many of the women marching in that column had already decided that death would be preferable to whatever lay ahead. They were wrong to think death was the worst possibility. What the Spartans had developed was something far more sophisticated than simple execution, far more terrible than slavery, far more devastating than anything these women could have imagined. It was a system designed not just to punish defeated enemies but to erase them entirely, to ensure that resistance to Sparta would destroy not just the men who fought, but the women who survived, the children who would never know their true heritage, the culture that would be absorbed and forgotten. If you want to understand how conquest has systematically targeted women throughout human history, how entire societies have been engineered to normalize atrocities by calling them strategic necessities, and stay with this story, because what happened to Eumelia and the women of Mantinia reveals a darkness in ancient warfare that changed how we must understand the true cost of military conquest. Subscribe right now and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because what you're about to learn will change how you see ancient history forever. The Spartans didn't just defeat their enemies, they made sure those enemies could never rise again by targeting the one thing that every society needs to survive: the next generation, and the women who would bear them. To understand what happened to women like Eumelia, you need to understand what made Sparta unlike any other Greek city-state. While Athens built monuments to philosophy and democracy, while other cities pursued art and commerce and the refinement of civilization, Sparta dedicated every resource, every institution, every aspect of daily life to a single purpose: producing the most effective killing force the ancient world had ever seen. Spartan boys were taken from their mothers at age 7 and raised in brutal communal barracks where weakness meant death and individual identity was crushed in favor of collective military purpose. The entire citizen class existed only to fight. They didn't farm. That was done by a massive enslaved population called helots who outnumbered Spartans perhaps 10 to 1. They didn't engage in trade or crafts. They trained for war from childhood until they were too old to hold a spear, and then they trained the next generation. This system produced warriors so feared that other Greek armies would retreat at the mere sight of Spartan forces approaching. But maintaining such a system required something most people don't consider when they romanticize Spartan military prowess. It required a constant supply of enslaved laborers to feed the warrior class. It required producing enough Spartan children to replace the warriors who died in endless campaigns. And it required ensuring that defeated enemies could never ever rise again to threaten Spartan dominance. This is where the systematic targeting of women became central to Spartan conquest strategy. The Spartans understood something that most ancient armies didn't fully grasp. Killing the men of a defeated city removed one generation of warriors, but the women would bear the next generation. If those women maintained their cultural identity and passed it to their children, they would create new enemies who would grow up seeking revenge. So Sparta developed methods to prevent this. Methods documented in the works of Plutarch, Xenophon, Herodotus, and Thucydides, historians who wrote based on direct observation or eyewitness accounts. When Sparta conquered a city, the surviving population was divided with calculated precision. Fighting-age men were executed or enslaved. The elderly and very young children were sometimes left behind or relocated, but women of childbearing age, roughly 15 to 40 years old, received special attention because they represented both threat and opportunity. These women were assessed by Spartan commanders who evaluated their age. health, social status, skills, and whether they had children. Based on these evaluations, they were divided into groups, each destined for different fates within the Spartan system. Some became helots, absorbed into the enslaved population, condemned to endless labor with no hope of freedom. But other women, particularly the wives and daughters of the defeated enemy's ruling class, faced something the ancient sources describe as worse than death, worse than slavery, worse than any physical torture they could endure and survive. These noble women were assigned as wives or concubines to Spartan citizens in forced marriages that served multiple strategic purposes simultaneously. The marriages humiliated the defeated enemy by demonstrating that even their highest-ranking women were now Spartan property. They produced children who would be raised as Spartans but who carried the blood of the conquered people, creating living proof that the enemy had been completely absorbed. And they prevented these women from bearing children who might grow up seeking revenge for their destroyed families. Ancient sources describe public ceremonies where captured women were dressed in wedding garments and forced through marriage rituals that mimicked traditional Greek weddings. Except everyone present understood they were witnessing not a union but a demonstration of total subjugation. A woman whose husband had been killed by Spartans days earlier would be made to speak wedding vows to a Spartan warrior, while the entire community watched her perform this ritual humiliation. Afterwards, she would be taken to her new husband's household where she would be expected to manage domestic affairs, bear children, and raise those children as Spartans who might one day fight against any remnants of her original people. For these women, survival meant active participation in the destruction of their own culture, teaching their children to honor the system that had murdered their fathers and stolen their mothers' lives. Some women adapted, finding ways to create meaning within impossible constraints, forming attachments to new children even while mourning lost families. Others never recovered, living their entire lives in states of profound grief that no amount of time could heal. Some chose death instead, throwing themselves from cliffs or finding other means of escape before they could be assigned to Spartan husbands, choosing to die with their honor intact rather than live as instruments of their own people's erasure. This was the machinery of Spartan conquest, refined over centuries into a system so efficient at destroying enemies that it didn't just kill them, it absorbed them, erased them, made their own children into weapons against their memory. And women like Eumelia, marching towards Sparta in the summer of 421 BC, were about to discover that surviving conquest was not mercy, it was just a different kind of ending, one that lasted a lifetime and echoed through generations that would never know where they truly came from or what had been taken from their mothers in the name of Spartan supremacy. Leave a comment below and tell me, how do you think this targeting of women in ancient warfare connects to patterns we still see in conflicts today? Because understanding history isn't just about knowing what happened. It's about recognizing what keeps happening, again and again, when we forget what conquest really means for those who survive it.